The moment those blue lights hit your rearview mirror, everything changes. Your grip tightens on the steering wheel. Your eyes flick between the mirror and the road ahead. Your heart rate picks up just a little, even if you know you've done nothing wrong. Maybe you slow down too quickly. Maybe you glance around wondering if it's really you they're pulling over. And then it hits you. It is you. So let me ask you something right away, and I want you to actually think about it for a second before we go any further. What was going through your mind the last time a police officer pulled you over, and how did you handle it? Drop your answer in the comments because I promise you, by the time you finish this, you might realize there was something important you missed, or something you could have done differently that would have completely changed the outcome. Now here's the part most people don't talk about openly. Traffic stops are not just about speeding tickets or broken taillights. They are one of the most unpredictable interactions between civilians and law enforcement, and sometimes those interactions cross a line. Not just a gray area, but a line so clear that it ends up costing cities thousands, sometimes millions, of dollars. And the frustrating part? A lot of those situations didn't have to happen at all. Let me walk you into a real kind of moment. You pull over. Engine still running. Hands on the wheel, just like you've been told. The officer approaches slowly, maybe shining a light inside your car even though it's daytime. He pauses slightly behind your rear door. That's not random. He's watching your movements. He's looking at your hands. He's already forming an opinion about you before he even says a word. Then the first question comes. Do you know why I pulled you over? Now right here, this is where most drivers make their first mistake. Not a huge one. Not something illegal, but something that starts shaping the entire interaction. You might say, yeah, I think I was going a little fast. Seems harmless, right? But what you just did was admit to a violation before the officer even presented evidence. You just made his job easier. Or you might say, no, I have no idea. That's better legally, but now the officer is watching how you say it, your tone, your eye contact, your hesitation. Because officers are trained to look for behavioral cues. Nervousness, overconfidence, avoidance, irritation. All of it feeds into how they proceed. And here's something people don't always realize. Nervousness alone is not proof of wrongdoing, but in the real world, it absolutely influences how far an officer decides to push the stop. Now imagine this scenario. The officer takes your license and registration. He walks back to his car. 5 minutes go by, then 10, then 15. At this point, a lot of drivers start getting anxious. You start wondering, what's taking so long? Are they running something? Did something come up? And here's where things can start crossing into dangerous territory, legally speaking. Officers are allowed to detain you for a reasonable amount of time to handle the purpose of the stop. That means checking your documents, running your license, verifying insurance, maybe writing a citation. But once that purpose is completed, the stop is supposed to end. That's the key part many people don't understand. If the officer starts extending the stop without a valid reason, asking unrelated questions, delaying without justification, that's where constitutional issues start creeping in. And yes, cities have paid for that. Because when a stop turns into an unlawful detention, even if nothing dramatic happens, even if no arrest is made, that alone can violate your rights. Now let's add another layer. The officer comes back and instead of handing you a ticket or warning, he starts asking questions. Where are you coming from? Where are you headed? Is this your vehicle? Anyone else in the car with you tonight? And here's where it gets uncomfortable, because the tone shifts. It's no longer just about the traffic violation. It starts feeling like an investigation. This is the moment where a lot of drivers feel pressure to cooperate fully, to answer everything, to be helpful. But here's the reality. You are not required to answer investigative questions unrelated to the reason for the stop. And yet, many people do. Not because they want to, but because the situation feels intimidating. There's a badge, there's authority, there's uncertainty, and the officer knows that. Now let's take it a step further. You decide to stay quiet or give minimal answers. Maybe you politely say, I'd prefer not to answer questions. The officer pauses. There's a shift in energy. You can feel it. He might say something like, "Why not? If you've got nothing to hide, it shouldn't be a problem." That line right there has caused more unnecessary escalations than almost anything else. Because now the driver feels challenged, pressured, almost accused. And sometimes the officer keeps pushing, repeating questions, changing tone, standing there longer than necessary, creating a sense of tension that makes you feel like silence is somehow suspicious. And this is where things can go too far. Because exercising your right to remain silent is not probable cause. It is not reasonable suspicion. But in real-world interactions, it often gets treated like it is. That's where mistakes happen. That's where rights get violated. And that's where lawsuits begin. Now let's talk about one of the most misunderstood moments during a traffic stop. Step out of the vehicle. A lot of people think officers need a specific reason to ask this. They don't. Under established law, officers can order drivers and passengers out of the vehicle during a lawful stop for safety reasons. But here's the catch. Just because they can ask you to step out doesn't mean everything that follows is automatically lawful. Let's say you step out, and now the officers start circling your vehicle, looking inside, asking more questions, maybe calling for backup. Time passes. More questions, more pressure. At some point, the original purpose of the stop fades into the background, and now you're essentially being detained for something else. This is where courts start asking serious questions later on. What was the justification for extending the stop? What specific observations led the officer to believe further investigation was necessary? Was there actual reasonable suspicion, or was it just a hunch? Because a hunch is not enough, and yet a lot of stops operate on exactly that. Now imagine a slightly different scenario. You have a passenger in the car, maybe a friend, maybe a family member. The officer suddenly shifts attention to them. What's your name? Do you have ID? Where are you coming from? Now your passenger is caught off guard. They weren't even driving. Here's something most people don't realize. Passengers also have rights. They are not automatically required to answer questions or provide identification unless there's a legal basis. But again, in the moment, that's not how it feels. It feels like you have to comply. Like refusing might make things worse. And sometimes that's exactly what happens. Officers might interpret hesitation as suspicious. They might escalate tone. They might prolong the stop. And if that prolonging isn't justified, it becomes a problem. A legal problem. One that cities have paid for over and over again. Now let's talk about something subtle but extremely important. Body language. Officers are trained observers. They watch your hands, your eyes, your posture. They notice small things most people don't even think about. Are you reaching too quickly? Are you avoiding eye contact? Are you overly talkative? Are you defensive? Every one of these behaviors can influence how the officer perceives the situation. And here's the tricky part. Even completely innocent behavior can be misinterpreted. You might be nervous because you've never been pulled over before. The officer might read that as deception. You might be trying to be polite and explain everything. The officer might see that as overcompensation. This is why so many routine stops turn into something bigger. Not because of what actually happened, but because of how it was perceived. Now let's get into a situation that has led to some of the most costly outcomes. Document retention. The officer takes your license and registration. Fine, that's standard. But then he keeps them, longer than necessary, while continuing to question you, while delaying the process. Here's the issue. As long as the officer has your documents, you are not free to leave. That means you are effectively being detained. If that detention goes beyond the time needed for the traffic stop without valid justification, it can become unlawful. And yes, courts have ruled against this kind of behavior. Cities have paid settlements because officers held on to documents while fishing for unrelated information. It might not feel dramatic in the moment. There's no shouting, no arrest, no obvious conflict. But legally, it matters. A lot. Now here's something that might surprise you. Sometimes the biggest mistake drivers make is not asserting their rights at all. Not rudely, not aggressively, but clearly. Because silence without clarity can be misinterpreted. Compliance without understanding can lead you into situations you didn't intend. For example, consent searches. Do you mind if I take a look inside your vehicle? This question sounds casual, almost friendly, but it carries serious consequences. If you say yes, you have just waived your Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable searches in that moment. The officer doesn't need probable cause, doesn't need a warrant, and once that search starts, anything found can be used against you, even if the original stop had nothing to do with it. This is one of the most common turning points in traffic stops, and it's one of the easiest to avoid. Now here's where things start tying back to the title we're talking about. When officers ignore limits, when they push beyond what the law allows, when they extend stops, pressure drivers, conduct searches without proper justification, eventually it catches up. Because every interaction leaves a record: dash cams, body cams, witness statements. And when those cases go to court, the details matter. The timing, the questions, the justification, all of it gets examined. And when it becomes clear that the stop went too far, that rights were violated, that procedures were ignored, that's when cities pay. Not the officer personally, the city, taxpayer money, sometimes hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions. And here's the part that should make you think. Many of those cases didn't involve violent crimes, didn't involve dangerous suspects. They started as simple traffic stops, a broken light, a minor speeding issue, a routine interaction that escalated because boundaries weren't respected. Now let me bring this back to you for a second. Imagine you're in that situation again. Blue lights behind you. You pull over. This time you're more aware. You understand why the officer is asking certain questions. You recognize when the stop is shifting beyond its original purpose. You know the difference between compliance and consent. You stay calm. You control your tone. You don't over-explain. You don't volunteer unnecessary information. You're respectful, but you're also aware. That balance right there is what changes everything. Because most traffic stops don't turn into major incidents, but the ones that do often follow a predictable pattern. Small misunderstandings, unnecessary questions, extended detentions, consent given without thinking, pressure applied subtly over time. And before you realize it, you're in a situation that feels much bigger than it should have been. That's why understanding these interactions matters, not just legally, but practically. Because in that moment, on the side of the road, you don't have time to look things up. You don't have time to second guess. You're relying on instinct. And instinct, if it's not informed, can lead you in the wrong direction. So the next time those blue lights appear, and they will at some point, you'll feel that same initial rush. But maybe this time, there's something else underneath it. Awareness. A quiet understanding of what's actually happening, beyond just the flashing lights and the badge at your window. And that changes how the entire interaction unfolds, even before a single word is spoken.